This is Ed McLeod, recently retired pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Raleigh after a ministerial career of about 40 years. You probably shouldn't encourage this. Well, all right.
Broadcasting just steps away, my friends, from the world-famous Miami University campus in the heart of scenic Oxford, Ohio. Just outside the city of Cincinnati, you're listening to Don't Encourage This, a series of interviews and conversations with artists, creatives, interfaith voices, and nerds. I'm your host, Mark Von Bullock. I'm a minister in the Presbyterian Church USA. This episode of the podcast is going to be a little bit different. This is something that I've wanted to do for a long time, and it's a little self-indulgent of me, so bear with me a little bit. But then again, the whole idea of doing a podcast in the first place is probably a little self-indulgent, I suppose. So there you have it. Back in the spring of 2024, I traveled to Raleigh, North Carolina to sit down with the Reverend Dr. Ed McLeod. You just heard his voice at the top of the intro. Dr. McLeod is a retired minister in the Presbyterian Church USA, a graduate of Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. Ed has served as the pastor of several churches, including First Presbyterian Church in Greer, South Carolina, First Presbyterian Church in Sumter, South Carolina, and most recently, First Presbyterian Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. Ed has, I think it's fair to say, a reputation for being a well-celebrated pastor and head of staff in our denomination, but I'm very biased, and there's a reason for that. The reason why I've wanted to sit down and record a conversation with him more selfishly is because Ed was my pastor growing up in the church in Sumter, and in my heart, he will always be my pastor. After I left Sumter, South Carolina, I also found myself going into the ministry. I am a minister in the Presbyterian Church USA, as are several other former members of that congregation and other congregations that Ed has served. We'll talk a little bit about that during this episode of the podcast. I don't think it's a stretch to say that Ed has played a significant role in our faith formation that led us from just being kids in church to being clergy and ministers who have followed the call ourselves. It's a little bit different from the conversations that I sometimes do on podcasts like this one, but I wanted to sit down to have a conversation with him about the journey of living a life in ministry. Growing up in the church, I don't know how many of us really take the time to think about what it's like to live as a pastor very much. I certainly didn't as a teenager. And when I reached the stage of life where I did find myself exploring the possibility of going into the pastorate, I discovered very quickly that I had no idea what in the world I was getting myself into. I certainly had thoughts and assumptions and preconceived notions of what I thought it might be like, but you discover pretty quickly that what you think ministry might be and what the actual realities of it are often very, very different. In fact, I would go so far as to say that you probably can't understand what it's like to walk this strange, odd, and wondrous journey until you walk it yourself. So I wanted to hear about Ed's walk on that journey. I wanted to learn and understand what it was like to be moved in the direction of ministry at a time in his own life when he certainly had other opportunities available to him. I wanted to hear his story, not just through the eyes of the 15-year-old teenager sitting in the pew looking up to him as his pastor, but through the eyes of a 40-year-old man who has now walked through some of that, but who still, if I'm honest, looks up to Ed as my pastor, in my heart, at any rate. So this is the kind of conversation we're going to have on this episode of the podcast. We talk shop a little bit about the challenges of preaching Sunday to Sunday, what his early days in ministry were like in places like Greer and Sumter, South Carolina, and Raleigh, North Carolina, and some of the behind-the-scenes lessons that he's learned as a head of staff in various different churches in various different contexts. We discuss how he has seen the church and the ministry change from his first days serving in the 1980s. I sat down with Ed at his home in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I want to apologize real quick about some of the audio that you're going to hear. We set up microphones in Ed's living room, but there are a few moments during our conversation where you can hear the microphones moving around a little bit. This may be nature's way of telling me that I'm due to get some new replacement shock mounts when I do these remote interviews while traveling. So it is what it is. It's probably not a huge deal. I tried to clean some of that up in editing as best I could, but you may still hear some of that from time to time. And, what can you do? This was a really meaningful experience for me to get to sit down with someone who I consider to be a mentor. It's a little bit different from what we ordinarily do on the podcast, and I hope that you, the listeners, don't find this too self-indulgent, but it meant a lot to me to get to do this, and I hope you find some meaning out of the conversation as well. Let's sit down with Dr. Ed McLeod. Now, you grew up in Hampton, Virginia, is that right?
I did. My first conscious memories, though, are in central Tennessee. My father was a Presbyterian pastor. He was serving a two-church field in North Carolina when I was born, but then we moved to a little town due south of Nashville, Tennessee. And then in the middle of my second grade year, we moved to the Tidewater area of Virginia, Newport News, Hampton. So that's where I really grew up in the wonder years. Graduated from Hampton High, but I don't have any family there anymore, but that's what I consider. I consider Raleigh my hometown now, but when people say, "Where'd you grow up?" Hampton, Virginia is, and I still have a lot of friends who live there. I guess it was a medium-sized city. I lived in a wonderful little neighborhood, lots of kids my age, community swimming pool where the competitive swimming was a big deal, which launched me. That was kind of my focus, and it's something I was able to do even through college. Met Jenny through that, and so I sometimes tell the story of my parents ponying up a couple $100 that they didn't really have to join this pool and how that changed the trajectory of my life.
Oh, wow.
Because had they not done that, I would have kept playing baseball and doing other things. But when they joined that pool, and I was the only one of the 4 kids who joined the swim team, but that became my sport. When I went on to college, I walked on to the team, and Jenny was a year behind me, so we met, and so the rest is history. So, yeah, it's those little serendipitous moments in life that you don't realize will have long-term impact on your life.
Yeah.
But it was a wonderful place to grow up. I walked to school, mostly with a group of guys that I hung around with, and some of whom are still friends of mine today, thankfully through Facebook, because we're scattered all over the place. But I've just got wonderful, wonderful memories of growing up in Hampton. The Hampton Coliseum was a venue for concerts. I went to my first ever live music concert there, the Four Seasons.
Oh, nice.
Which is, that tells you how old I am. The Virginia Squires basketball team played at the Hampton Coliseum, so I got to see Dr. J early in his career. So I have a lot of good memories about Hampton, Virginia.
And you mentioned your parents. What were they like when you were growing up?
My father was a pastor. My father was the disciplinarian. My mother was the fount of unconditional love. And so I think I got the kind of balance that you need. My father was a high expectation father. My mother was going to love me even when I'm sure I disappointed her. It was great. I think they were good parents. My father was a workaholic when it came to church stuff, so he was gone a lot of evening meetings. I don't think he thought anything could operate at the church without his hands on it. So Mama was the more hands-on parent. I was the second of 4 siblings, and my mother was a kindergarten teacher, and so she was working all the time too. But it was just a good life. I felt loved and supported and encouraged from both my parents. And I think my siblings would tell you the same thing.
You mentioned that about your dad. It's real easy to get sucked into that mentality of, if I'm not at this meeting, if I'm not doing this, the whole house of cards will fall apart. And I think that's very common for a lot of pastors and a lot of ministers.
I think so too, but for me it was a cautionary tale, because when he moved from the church where I grew up in Newport News, Virginia, to a new church in Virginia Beach, Virginia, that church struggled mightily. And within a number of years, that church was really no more. They sold their building to a different church, different denomination. And so for me, that was this cautionary tale that when I entered the ministry, I realized one of my goals, one of my responsibilities is to enable a church family to run the church.
Right.
That I've said jokingly to some of my colleagues that we're all in interim ministry. I mean,
that's true.
My last pastorate was 19 years, but that's 19 years out of a 200-year-old church. And so that was my interim. There was an old phrase, I think, in the old Book of Order, equipping the saints for ministry or something like that, and it was because watching my father almost, I think, overdo. And I'll tell just a little anecdote. When I was in Greer, South Carolina, the clerk of session, after I'd been there about 4 years, came to me and said, "I think I know what you're doing." And I said, "What am I doing?" He said, "You're trying to make us elders be elders." And I said, "That's exactly what I'm doing. Is I want you to be the leaders." I said, "You're just as ordained as I am.
Yeah.
I want you to be the leaders of this church because you were here before I got here and you'll be here after I'm gone."
I mean, that's very well said, and that's what we all should be doing. Right. We both belong to the Presbyterian Church USA, which has this sort of representational form of government where the congregation elects elders and church officers. And in our polity, that's really kind of the idea, is that the pastors are leaders and guides, but we are not the kings or queens of the church or the bosses. Right. Our job is really to, as you said, to equip the leaders to really captain the ship certainly from a spiritual sense. What you said a moment ago about all of us being interims, Mark DeVries, who is an author who's written about young adult ministry and youth ministry, right, he expressed something similar in one of his books. I'm paraphrasing here. All of us are temporary. None of us are permanent in ministry. And eventually we will either leave the church, retire, or die.
Right.
Hopefully in that order, but one way or another, this tenure is going to come to an end. Right. And part of our job is to make sure that the church is going to carry on just fine when that day comes.
Exactly. Yeah, I have said to churches, and I said it when I left the church where we were together, that the verdict about my ministry is not at this red-hot moment. The verdict on my ministry is often in the years that followed. Did I do an adequate job preparing you to carry on without me? But I think I got a glimpse of that with kind of the cautionary tale of a father who, with all good intentions, maybe overdid for his church.
Sure. And I think that's also well said. I've been in ministry for a little while now. I'm not quite as long as you have been. But my sort of feeling is, if I start hearing words like, "Oh, Mark, we wouldn't know what we would do without you," I get a little nervous when I hear that. I don't hear that as, my ego puffing up like, "Oh, I must be doing a great job." Right. Because what I hear is, "Oh, I need to be equipping them more." There should be a sense. It's nice that they like the work that I'm doing, but there should also be a sense of confidence that they can carry this on indefinitely.
I once heard, so this sounds counterintuitive, but I heard somebody once say that if you have somebody in your organization who is indispensable, you ought to get rid of them right away because no organization ought to hinge on one person's presence, humanly speaking.
Yeah. You mentioned swimming in your growing up years. I feel like I vaguely remember hearing you either preach or write that one of your earliest jobs was a lifeguard. Is that right?
Correct.
And was that your first job?
Technically, my first job would have been with one of my buddies in Hampton, Virginia, Scott Miller, and I had a lawn mowing company. That's too grandiose. We probably mowed the lawns of 6 or 8 of our neighbors growing up. But my first actual paying job, where somebody gave me a paycheck, was as a lifeguard at the Briar Queen Recreation Association. And I did that starting at the age of 16, I guess. And I think the hourly rate back then was $1.35 an hour, $1.65 an hour. But I loved that job. And I've actually told the story that I had an aha moment in that lifeguard job that has resonance in the ministry, is that all of a sudden I'm on the lifeguard stand twirling my whistle thinking this is my domain. And all of a sudden it dawned on me that these parents are depending on me to keep their children safe.
Oh,
I just, it was all of a sudden the weight of the job just sort of, oh my gosh, do they, and it's the same sort of aha moment that I think I had at some point climbing in a pulpit, realizing, oh gosh, these people, they're expecting gospel here.
Yeah.
They're expecting some healing words, some hopeful words. So it's, I think it's important at some point to have these moments where you realize this is not just a job. There's a significant calling here, and I don't want to overstate what it is to be a lifeguard, but parents do send their kids to the pool trusting that the lifeguards are going to keep their eye on them.
Absolutely. Well, and that's why we put the sign on the pool that says lifeguard on duty. That's a cue to the parents like, hey, they're going to be fine.
Right.
And then, of course, that depends on you making sure that they're going to be fine.
Right. But I think as a 16 or 17-year-old, I remember just sitting in the lifeguard chair, and all of a sudden the weight of that hit me. And I think I probably was a better lifeguard after that. It was no longer about, look at me up here on the lifeguard chair. That's one of those formative experiences in my life.
What was 16, 17-year-old Ed McLeod like?
Oh, geeky. I was probably awkward. I was a competitive swimmer, but not a great one. I had a lot of good friends. I was awkward with girls.
I wouldn't know anything about any of these things you're describing. It's completely alien to my experience.
I loved sports, and so my friends and I, we played a lot of basketball. This is before the internet age. I was probably a pretty normal teenage kid. I was a pretty good student. I probably underachieved some, but I think I was kind of a pretty normal, awkward, geeky 16, 17-year-old kid whose pretty normal family life, I think, kept me grounded. Very active in the church. In one sense, my church life and my rest of my life were disconnected because the church was in Newport News, Virginia. I lived in Hampton. I didn't really go to school with any of the kids I went to church with, but I loved church. It was a small church, like a 100-member church. Maybe 60 people in church on Sunday morning.
So very tight-knit.
Very tight-knit, small youth group, but we all cared about each other. I think about this every now and then. I was maybe a late middle school kid, junior high kid, and I watched the first member of our high school youth group go off to Vietnam.
Oh, my goodness.
That was just the era. It was the kind of church, at lunch after church, my mother would say, was so-and-so in church today? And my father would say, oh, yeah, she was sitting over there behind so-and-so. Mm-hmm. I mean, you sort of knew where everybody was, and everybody showed up for potluck suppers, and it was just a wonderful kind of community. I felt very nurtured at home and at the church.
I think those smaller churches, too. My first call was I was a solo pastor at a teeny tiny church like that. And there, of course, are a lot of benefits to churches having the resources that larger churches have, programming-wise, budget-wise. But I think one of the benefits that smaller congregations like that have is that tight-knitness. I mean, larger churches can certainly be tight-knit, but there's something about when the community is that intimate, the sense of we are really here to take care of one another and to care for the church and to serve the church is so focused.
Right.
It really becomes personal being the church together in a way that I don't want to say can be lost in larger churches, but it's certainly different when you've got large endowments and things like that.
Well, in large churches, it's easier for people, if they want to be, to remain anonymous and kind of way on the edge. But when it's 100 people, there's not much of an edge. Everybody's kind of in the circle. I don't want to over glamorize it, but it's the same sort of metaphor of a small town life and a big city life. Sometimes it's nice to have a little anonymity because sometimes in small town life, everybody knows your business and everybody shares your business.
That's true.
When there's a need, they usually come running.
Where did 16, 17-year-old Ed McLeod see adult Ed McLeod going? I certainly did not know early on that I wanted to be in ministry. Was that something that you sensed early on, or did you imagine a different career path?
Yeah, I imagined a different career path. I think other people imagined this career path for me, but I think it's mostly because they expect preachers' kids usually either flee from the church or serve the church. So I never really had a great ambition to do this. My plan when I went off to college, I majored in government political science. My plan was to go to law school. But slowly over time, I sort of moved away from that, but then I didn't know what I was going to do. And so when I'm a senior at William & Mary, about to have a BA in government, I applied for a job with the Lane Furniture Company in Alta Vista, Virginia. Some of your potentially older listeners will know they were the makers of Lane cedar chests or something like that. But anyway, so they offered me this job as a production manager. I have no idea why. But I turned it down, and this would have been in the 1980s. The economy was not great. People weren't turning down jobs. And so, but I think I was already beginning to deal with this restless situation of, am I being called to ministry?
Yeah.
And I actually applied to seminary at that point. And then it's another one of the stories that people who know me have heard. I sent an application off to seminary, which takes a while to put together because you got to do references, you got to get your transcript and all that. So I sent it off to seminary. And the next day, I wrote a letter to the seminary office that said, please disregard the application you received yesterday, because I just said, I'm not ready.
Oh, wow.
And which I embarked upon then a year off, a year of just sort of discernment. And it was during that year that I said, okay, I'm going to try this. So with a kind of a wait-and-see attitude on the assumption that I was not going to like it. It took me a while to begin to envision myself doing what I've done for the last 40 years.
Yeah. Well, I can relate to that. I mean, my journey into seminary went a little out of order from what you described, but it had a lot of the same elements, which is that I approached seminary very reluctantly. Mm-hmm. I had a sense that this might be the call, but like you said, I kind of went into it assuming I wasn't going to like it,
right,
and that it was maybe a flip of the coin whether I would stick with it or
right,
drop out and do something else.
Right.
Down the line, there was also a year of discernment in there as well.
Yeah.
So I can resonate with a lot of what you're describing.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's, I do think that that's not entirely uncommon with folks who go into the ministry. There certainly are folks that go into it, they just kind of know from day one. They have this clarity of, this is what I'm called to do. I'm going to go through seminary, go through the process and get my hand stamped, and they know.
Right.
But I think there are just as many folks who go through it who are really unsure, and it is sort of more of a deeply personal spiritual exploration of, this is serious. Am I serious about this? Right. I mean, it certainly was that way for me at any rate.
Yeah. I've sometimes told people, if there's anything else you can do, you ought to do it. Don't go to seminary, don't go into the ministry because it might make your grandmother happy or whatever. If you're meant to go in the ministry, God will ultimately get you. You won't be able to run away from the call. But I think there are a lot of people who wrestle with it pretty mightily, and there's plenty of biblical example of those who do too.
There certainly are.
Yeah.
There certainly are.
I do think a lot of people go into the ministry because church for them was this warm, comfortable blanket of acceptance and whatnot. And they think, well, gosh, wouldn't it be great to have a career with that? But being the pastor of a church is a different thing. You're not always going to be warmly embraced.
Yeah. You mentioned going to William and Mary. How did you start to see that as a college path for you as a next step?
Well, that's kind of funny. Well, not funny. So I applied to 3 schools when I was in, in junior in high school or whatever, senior high school. I applied to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill because my father went there, and he and I was a big basketball fan. I was a big Dean Smith fan. And at some point, before I became a swimmer, I loved playing basketball, and I used to envision myself playing basketball at UNC.
That'd be fun.
Until I stopped growing at 5'11", and so I applied to Chapel Hill, Virginia Tech, because a lot of my friends were going to Virginia Tech. I was pretty sure I could get in. It's a good school in Virginia, and William and Mary, and I got accepted at all 3. So I had the choice of all 3. Truth be told, the thing that swung my decision was it was an in-state school, pretty inexpensive, and I thought I could walk on to the swim team.
Oh, nice.
Which I did. My sister was finishing up her degree at Mary Baldwin College in Stanton, Virginia, private women's school. So I knew that was a pretty expensive place. And William and Mary was a remarkable bargain educationally. Sure. And I think I knew intuitively that the size of the place would fit me better. I'm basically an introvert. I knew I wouldn't get Dean Smith did not recruit me to play basketball. So I thought that I could easily get swallowed up at a place like Chapel Hill or even Virginia Tech, which was a pretty big school at the time. So I just felt like the scale of William and Mary would fit me better. And it did. It was a good match for me.
And that's where you met Jenny?
That's where I met Jenny. She was a year behind me.
And that was through swimming?
Through swimming, yeah. She was actually a very good swimmer. I'm glad she's not in within earshot. She was recruited to come there and was an All-American swimmer while there, and is in the Hall of Fame. She's in the Athletic Hall of Fame at William
I didn't know
and
any of
Mary.
that.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
Yeah, she was really a good swimmer. She grew up in really great programs in the Philadelphia area. I was just a summer league, high school type swimmer. It was a good place for me to go for lots of reasons.
Yeah. Now, so you mentioned a little bit earlier, you touched on some of us feel the call to ministry very enthusiastically, and for some of us, it's a little bit more of a reluctant path. How did you find yourself going from William and Mary into the seminary? This is me trying to avoid asking, what was your call to ministry, Ed? Because that's what everybody asks ministers. I'm trying to avoid asking that question, but I guess I'm asking that question. How did you start to see that as a possible next step to explore, even if there may have still been some uncertainty?
Part of the answer to that would be I grew up, John Calvin is not on everybody's radar these days, but I grew up believing that John Calvin said every human life has a purpose, that God has a purpose for every human life. And so I grew up with that pretty deeply embedded in me as a sense of, okay, there's a reason I'm here. I'm supposed to serve some purpose. I actually believe that's what it means. The pursuit of happiness is to pursue a purpose that means something.
Yes.
But, again, I thought I was going to go to law school. I became aware that was not going to be my purpose. Then it became clear that building cedar chests with the Lane Furniture Company was not my purpose. And so I finally just sort of relented and said, okay, there's a lot about the ministerial life that I will love. I mean, I love the intellectual engagement. I love to write. I had a teacher in high school who sort of planted in me this love of language, love of words, and love of communicating. I did not love public speaking. I took one public speaking course in college and got a C, probably a generous C, just because there was nothing about it that I liked.
Sure.
And I did have positive feelings about the church. I knew that the church was a very important institution in the world. And I did have one kind of life experience during my gap year. We didn't call it a gap year. Nobody had thought about that, my year off. But I had a really interesting experience where a friend of mine coaxed me into doing what was called the Nantahala Outdoorsman's Triathlon, where you swim a certain length of, I don't remember the distance, but you swim in this lake, you run a few miles up this mountain road, and then you get in a canoe and paddle a canoe down a whitewater river back down to the lake where you swam.
That's quite a test of endurance.
It is. And that's back when I just graduated from college. I was still pretty fit from being a college swimmer. But we went up the day before, because most of us had never canoed in a whitewater river before. And so we were learning how to do that. And halfway down, or most of the way down the river, my boat flipped and I got caught under a rock. Fortunately, had I emerged from the boat on one side of the boat, I'd still be under that rock because there's no way to get out. But I popped up, surfaced downriver. It took us about a half an hour to get the boat out. And so that night, my glasses got torn away. So
that sounds terrifying.
It was terrifying. So, but that night I'm trying to sleep and it sort of came through my mind, okay, God, I actually don't think this is how God works, but if you were trying to get my attention, you did. That was one of those pivotal moments where I began to think, okay, I'm going to try this seminary thing. If it's not for me, it's not for me, and I'll find my purpose someplace else. I think I was afraid of being on campus with a bunch of people that were holier than thou. And so I went on to seminary. I met some friends that I resonated with who I think were having the same kind of struggles I was, same kind of ponderings and testings. And I loved the academic part of it. I loved the faculty. I loved everything about it. What sealed the deal for me was my first summer. I did a summer internship at a little church in eastern North Carolina, Tarboro, North Carolina. There's a wonderful church, still a great church there. And I basically served as their pastor because the head of staff left for the summer and basically left me in charge.
Oh, wow.
So I preached almost every week. I was doing Bible studies. I was doing stuff with youth groups.
Must have been a great experience.
It was so great. And all of a sudden I thought, I had no idea I would like this. And I just loved it. Then I went back to seminary energized, but okay, I'm ready to go out and do this.
Yeah.
And, but it took me by surprise.
I'm so glad that you mentioned too the
anxiety about going into seminary, like being a little worried that like, am I even going to fit in here?
Right.
Like, is this going to be just a community of monks? Because that's exactly how I felt going into seminary. I had no idea. I don't know that many people really know what to expect from seminary. My big fear going into all this was, am I still going to be able to be Mark
Right.
on the other side of this?
Right.
It's heartening for me to hear that you had a sort of a similar concern.
It was. Oh, yeah. And I think that's a pretty normal concern. But once I found out, we played flag football. We played ping pong. We just we had fun. It was just a nice group of people who just wanted to serve the church. I mean, there were a few folks who were a little holier than thou, but that's fine. They probably thought I should be a little holier myself.
And that's probably true in most schools in general.
Right.
There's always going to be a group of folks that think that they're either snootier than other people or better students or whatever. I mean, that's some of that is just school culture, whether it's a seminary or not.
I think one of the big things that surprised me about seminary is that it's actual graduate school with high expectation. And I think some people go to seminary thinking, well, this will just be a little bit like Sunday school on steroids.
That's exactly what I thought it was going to be.
It's a faculty filled with PhDs who have high expectations, and which is great. I mean, but it was a little jarring. But in retrospect, I'm grateful for that.
It took me maybe a year or two to sort of normalize to what exactly seminary is, because that's exactly what I thought it was going to. I thought it was going to be just church school,
right?
Where I'm going to learn about ministry stuff, and to some extent it is, but I had no idea what I was getting into.
Right.
When I
Not many people do.
Do you remember the first time that you preached a sermon from the pulpit?
From that pulpit,
or from any pulpit?
Probably the first time I ever preached a sermon from a pulpit would have been when I was home for Christmas break. And my father asked me to preach in my home church the Sunday after Christmas or something like that. I'm guessing. Oh, I mean, I did Youth Sunday and that kind of thing, but I'm not. That's probably not what you mean. I think it's probably at Kings Grant Presbyterian Church, where my father was the pastor in Virginia Beach. Probably the Sunday after Christmas, which. In retrospect, I realized he just wanted a break.
the day off after Advent.
And he had somebody who would preach without expectation of an honorarium because I was getting free room and board. I have no idea what I preached about, but I'm sure the congregation was very warm and receptive just because they would be.
Sure.
I mean, I doubt I broke any new theological ground or made any great biblical insights, but I think I was pretty warmly received by that congregation.
Well, and it's the Sunday after Christmas. Most families are probably somewhat exhausted after the holidays. Cool, they go into church and like, there's Ed up there. There's something delightful about that.
For a number of years, I've helped with a program in Roanoke, Virginia that helps kind of foster some gifts in young pastors. And there's a member, it's at Second Presbyterian Church in Roanoke. There's some members of that church who were members of my father's church in Virginia Beach. And she was on the session when I was coming through as a candidate for ministry. And so we've been able to reconnect. It's just wonderful. One of the great things about church is just these moments where you reconnect, the connectional nature. And now I'm retired. And so she's basically seen the full gamut of my ministry.
That's really neat.
It's just wonderful.
What memories do you have from the early days of preaching? I'm really interested in the preaching process. And do you have any memories of like just getting started with preaching on a Sunday morning to a congregation in a pulpit, how that's maybe changed over time?
Well, I hope what hasn't changed over time is my respect for what it is, for what it means to stand in a pulpit. I have a high regard for what that means and for what the work that needs to go to be ready, whatever ready means. Yeah. There's a kind of a cliche that a sermon is never finished, but eventually you got to preach it. There was a phrase that I coined years ago that I wanted always to be seen as someone who preached with clarity and conviction. And I remember a woman in my very first church came to me after I'd been there a couple of years. She said, "You really believe this stuff, don't you?" I said, "I do." I said, I try never to say anything that I don't believe or that I don't believe to be true about the scripture or theology or whatnot. I often did work with confirmation classes or communicants classes. And I made a decision early on that I was going to try to preach in a way that the 12 and 13-year-old people in the congregation could understand.
Yes.
because I figured if they did, maybe there's a chance that their 50-year-old and 60-year-old grandparents might understand me too. So that's always been my target audience. And that's not to say, because I think 12 and 13 and 14-year-old kids are pretty smart.
Yeah, I do too.
I think they can see when there's integrity and when there's not. I think they can see a bluff a mile away.
Yes, they can.
And so they've been kind of my people, and you are one of those. So you did, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but there's a certain kind of preaching that I like to hear.
Yes.
And so it's been important to me to have something to say that was relevant to people's lives, maybe that's relevant to what's going on in the world at the moment, but mostly to be true to the text. I mean, I'm one of these kind of preachers who, for most of my ministry, I've been a lectionary preacher, and I've done that as a guard against just finding my favorite 3 texts and just finding different ways to preach them. Although I do believe most of us just do have the same 6 or 7 or dozen themes that we return to again and again.
Well, to be fair, Scripture also returns to the similar themes again and again.
They do. But as a lectionary preacher, I have at least tried to look at the sweep of the Scriptures.
Yeah.
And so, I'm very grateful for a biblical faculty at Union when I was there, and the continuing education I did after getting out. You'll be glad to know, for the first dozen years of my ministry, I think I took a class with Walter Brueggemann.
Oh, yes.
Just about every summer. I'd find out where he was teaching, and I'd go.
So jealous. Walter Brueggemann, for those who may or may not know, is a renowned, to say he's renowned is an understatement, scholar and theologian of the Old Testament. Certainly he is also a scholar of the New Testament, but he's really known for his work on the Old Testament. I think probably, especially the work he did in the 80s and in the 90s, and today still, but his scholarship on the Hebrew Bible was seminal.
And he was sort of coming into his stardom, which is not too strong a word for Brueggemann, when I was beginning early in the ministry, and it was just great. And so I'm so back to I'm just grateful for the kind of foundational work I had with biblical scholars, because I wanted to be true to the biblical text in my preaching. And I've joked about this. I had 2 formative theological professors, Doug Otati, who now teaches at Davidson, and John Leith, who was sort of a legend. In my preaching, I tried to make sure I wouldn't say anything that would cause either of them heartburn.
Yeah.
They were sort of my theological guardrails. Doug, kind of a more progressive a voice, and Dr. Leith a more conservative voice. And I knew that if I could keep them in the conversation with me, I'd be okay.
I'll share just a quick sidebar about Walter Brueggemann very quickly. The very first podcast I ever did was with Walter Brueggemann.
Oh, wow.
We were in his home at his dining room table. At the beginning of the interview, his answers were sharp and astute. But as we kept going, as I started bringing in these topics, I could see him start to kind of get into it.
Right.
And it's almost like he's drifting away from Mark and he's getting into the Brueggemann zone.
Right.
And at one point, the passion took over and he was just almost pointing at me.
Right.
And if you go back and listen to the recording, you can hear my voice is starting to shake from awe and a little bit of terror.
Right. Well, it's like being in the presence of an Old Testament prophet, which just makes you nervous. Now, one of my most remarkable memories of being in one of his classes once, and he's just working maybe something on wisdom literature, and somebody raised their hand in the back of the class and just raised a question that was not really on topic, but Brueggemann answered it by citing a section of a book that he thought would be helpful to this. And he said, I think you'll find that on about page 150 on the right-hand side bottom. And it's like, oh my God. And it wasn't kind of an Old Testament text. It was more kind of sociological. But I'm thinking, this guy reads everything. And not only does he read everything, he remembers where on the page he's read what he's read. So what a mind.
Absolutely. Nick Yoda, who of course you and I both know, when Walter Brueggemann was still living in Cincinnati, they would get lunch, I think once a month.
Nice.
Nick said something to Walter, I don't even remember what it was he said. Something like, when then Scripture comes alive or something. And Brueggemann looked at him and goes, Nicholas, that is just brilliant. That's one of the most insightful things I've ever heard. And Nick turned to him and said, well, Walter, you wrote that. That was just from one of your books. And he goes, whatever.
Right.
I really appreciate what you said about respecting what it means to stand in the pulpit and do this. Like you, I'm someone who likes to write. I really enjoy writing.
You're a good writer.
Well, thank you. And I like different kinds of writing, from plays to essays or fiction. But I think that sermons are the most difficult form of writing there is, in my opinion. To do it well and to do it right, to be ready, as you say, it's the most difficult tapestry to weave because you want to be true to the text, to speak to where we are. Like you, I also want younger audiences to be able to follow what I'm saying and get something out of it and not just feel like I'm talking to grown-ups or whatever. You want it to have integrity and be engaging and all this stuff. But most importantly, that it glorifies God. It's real hard. A lot of people can write a 15-minute speech and get up in a pulpit and do it, but that's not really what preaching is real. To do it really right, I don't think there's a more difficult genre of writing, in my opinion.
Stephen King has a great little essay on the challenge of writing short stories. If you read that essay, and every time he says short stories, replace it with sermon, it's very similar. With a longer form, you can go down this rabbit trail. You can do this, you can do that. But with a short story, it requires an economy of words.
Yes.
And a clarity of words that every word matters. I think the same challenge is there in a sermon. Every word matters. Every transition matters. Because it's not only, you're not writing for people to read, you're writing for people to hear. And for people's attention span is woefully short, and I think getting shorter. And so keeping people with you, that's just one of the challenges, is to write something that you can say verbally that people will hear and stay with you from point A to point B.
That's right.
It's quite the trapeze act.
You do follow the lectionary, and you like the sort of the discipline that brings of trying to cover the sweep of the scriptures. But you also mentioned that we all have our favorite passages. Do you have favorite passages to preach?
Yeah, but mine are just the classics. I mean, I've said to people that if somebody said, we're going to drop you into a congregation, you get to preach one sermon, then you would pull you out again, what would it be? It'd be the parable of the prodigal son. And with an emphasis that we assume that the young son is the prodigal. I'm not sure the young son is the one who's prodigal in that story.
Yeah.
And so I just think that's the gospel in its essence, that story. Yeah, I'm a lectionary preacher, but I'm probably heavily on the gospels. I probably love all the gospels equally. I love the pure clarity of Mark. You know, he's just in a hurry to tell us everything. I love all the kind of rich symbolism and Hebrew scripture references in Matthew. Luke is probably my favorite just because of things like prodigal son, Good Samaritan. I mean, I think it has a global awareness of what it means to be a follower of this Jesus person. And I'm one of the crazy people. I love preaching stewardship sermons. And so stewardship season is a season because I do think a person's how they are a steward with all the gifts they've been given is one of the clearest indications of spiritual maturity. Yeah. And I just think we need to be clear about that. And so texts that lend themselves toward stewardship, some people hate when those pop up. I don't. Because I think those are things we need to hear. With all of our affluence, we have affluence that previous generations couldn't have even imagined.
Sure.
Dr. Leith, who I mentioned a while ago, used to say things like, our ancestors out of their poverty built great cathedrals. We, in our abundance, seek out the lowest bidder. I think there's something to that.
I wanted to ask you about your time in Sumter. I, of course, came to know you as you were my pastor growing up in First Presbyterian Church in Sumter, South Carolina. And I'm so sorry, Ed, remind the church you were at before that.
I was at First Pres in Greer, South Carolina.
Now, what was that experience like?
Greer is a small town, sort of nestled between Greenville and Spartanburg. A church family that loved each other and loved their pastors. So many people who are so deeply devoted to the church, devoted to a life and ministry in the community. It was hard for me to leave that church to take the call to Sumter. I'll briefly tell this story. I said no to this Sumter committee 3 times.
Oh, wow.
You probably don't even know that.
No, I didn't know that.
So they came. It's
very Jewish, by the way. They have to ask 3 times before you get a yes.
Yeah. I mean, so they extended the call, and I just said, I just don't think I can do this. They came back again a few weeks later. I just said, no, this is, and then they came a third time. I think I'm right about this, that I said no. And finally, Jenny, my wife, in her wisdom said, you need to be clear in your mind why you keep saying no to these folks so you can give them a clear answer so they'll stop coming. And that's when I said, okay, why is, because it was a great opportunity.
Sure.
I mean, I'd heard great things about the church. It's beautiful. I mean, it remains in my mind probably the most glorious sanctuary I've ever preached. It's so beautiful. But I came to the conclusion that the reasons that I was saying no to that call was that I was so happy in Greer, and I didn't think anybody else could do what I was doing in Greer.
Oh, interesting.
And so as soon as I said that out loud to myself, I realized I had to be open to moving now. Because one, my ministry was not supposed to be about me being happy. And secondly, worse of all, that was just pure idolatry to think nobody else could do what I was doing in Greer.
Wow.
So,
and it kind of connects a little bit to what you shared about your dad earlier, that you had seen maybe a bit of that in your own.
Yeah. And so that at that point, maybe I said no to him twice, and on the third go round, once I sort of had that come to Jesus meeting with myself and why I kept saying no, I said yes.
That's an amazing story.
Yeah, but it was a real eye-opening kind of thing of that ministry is not about the minister's happiness.
Yeah.
And again, it was a reality check because the first Pres Greer's done fine. They did fine without me.
Sure.
And but I had to confront that kind of idolatry that I alone could do what I was doing.
What were those first few years in Sumter like?
I loved the scale of the town. It was a nice size. It was bigger than Greer, so there were kind of more opportunities. But it was still a small town, people deeply invested. I mean, I feel like I got to know people who are still very good friends today. I loved kind of working with a larger staff. That was kind of a new stretch for me. I had some learning to do about that. But what I also found out pretty quickly that being a pastor of that church in Sumter put you on the radar of some of the other organizations in town. So pretty quickly I got invited to serve on the board at the YMCA and Habitat and those kind of things. In my more naive self, I thought, well, isn't it nice? They've heard about my good leadership. and then I realized, First Pres is supporting all these organizations. And
that's true. They've for a long time, they've been big supporters of those. So, that's natural.
And so it's smart for them to have the pastor of that church on their board.
Sure.
But that exposed me, and the same thing has happened in Raleigh. That exposed me to some great leaders who are not in the church, but leaders in the community. And I learned things from all of them. But when we moved to Sumter, we brought young kids with us. And that's such an easy way to move into a community because your kids get involved in school. You get to know the other people who, the other parents. And again, we made some just really, really close friends. And it was a good place to do ministry.
And your son Randall and I were very, very close growing up in Sumter as adolescents together, and that was, I was thinking about that, kind of my first vaguest curiosity about the ministry was sort of knowing you in the background as Randall's dad, and of course knowing you as the pastor of our church. Sort of my first contact with your family was that Randall and I as teenagers, we hung out all the time and just goofed around and did silly teenager stuff. But there was like this germ of a thought back there, like, oh yeah, his dad's the pastor. Like that's sort of weird. Yeah. And that was probably about the extent of how far the thought went. Right. I'm afraid to ask the question I'm about to ask. What was adolescent Mark Von Bullock like? Oh, you were a nerdy kind of, but so smart and so interested in kind of life and didn't seem to be as wrapped up in, weren't so wrapped up in trying to live a life following cultural norms, just you were just a free spirit with a great sense of humor and seemed to delight in the fact that you knew you were a little wacky. Yes. And that was okay. To which I gave your
parents credit. You just had a cool family to me. One memory I have, and you'll remember this, is when we were all supposed to be going off on this whitewater rafting trip. And and you were a little bit late. So I think we left without you, and we had to figure out, maybe Peggy came and picked you up or something like that.
She did.
I have only positive memories of you, and I was so glad Randall found you as a friend, and that y'all found each other. Because he was in his own way, he was bookish, and he liked to read, and he was an introvert, and he did some sports, but that wasn't his main gig. He was. You probably helped him tap into his love for the school plays and theater and that kind of stuff.
Oh, sure.
And so I'm a big believer that people kind of find their people.
Yeah.
And sometimes it doesn't happen till college, because sometimes in high school, everybody is so worried about conforming to norms that nobody wants to be a little bit, marching to the beat of a different drummer. Anyway, I was glad you and Randall found each other and could be good friends and do things your own way sometimes.
Yeah. Randall and I were part of a group of friends along with Joseph Safford, who was another good friend of ours. Right. And, we were kind of the nerdy boys who sort of stuck together. And we were growing up in the in the South, where, kind of like you said, it's Sumter is not a nerdy culture per se. So it was.
Sumter's it's baseball, hunting, fishing. It's just your Southern. It is, and so there are certain expectations about Southern men. I've told this story to a lot of people, but I was doing high school Bible study one Wednesday night. I apparently wasn't a typical Sumter male either, because I talked to the group about this possum had invaded our backyard, and I was trying to get rid of it. And I got my hose out with the sprayer, just irritating it, and finally it ran away. And one of the young women in the youth group said, "Why didn't you shoot it?" She said, "Why didn't you use your gun?" I said, "I don't have a gun." She said, "You don't have a gun?" And all of a sudden I realized, okay, I've fallen down on your ranking of what it means to be a man in this culture.
Well, and our family didn't have a gun either. And truthfully, a lot of families didn't. But a lot of families do. I mean, that's very common
part of the culture
in towns like Sumter. And
and that's all right.
And so in 2004, you accepted the call to First Presbyterian Church here in Raleigh.
Yeah.
You served here in Raleigh for, was it about 20 years?
I was here for 19 years, almost exactly 19 years.
You're almost, I think, universally celebrated in sort of peers of ministry as a wonderful head of staff.
Well, I appreciate that.
And that's my perception. And I wonder, what sort of lessons have you learned serving in that role in different contexts like Raleigh? How similar or different might it have been from Sumter? What have you learned about being a head of staff in different contexts like that?
Several kind of pretty basic lessons. One is every staff member is different. And so every staff member needs a different kind of support and or supervision, encouragement. Some need more hand-holding at times. Some just need to be given the freedom to try to do new things, the freedom to fail if they fail, knowing that if they do, I'll be with them. I learned early on, my first head of staff in my first church basically said, my policy is always praise in public, critique in private.
Yeah, it's a good policy.
And it's not rocket science. It's just good. It's just good manners. I've always just tried to be the biggest cheerleader I could for the staff. The key thing is when you have the opportunity to hire somebody, to hire people who are good at what they do and who seem to have emotional intelligence, self-differentiated, and who can handle some conflict, who can handle some pushback. And then what I've always tried to say to people is, I will not micromanage you. I've got my own full-time job that keeps me very busy, but I will support you in any way that I can for you to be successful. And that's generally worked for me. I like to know what's going on in all areas of the life of the church, but I don't need to have my hands on it. I've been very fortunate over time to be able to work with people who are really, really good at what they do, and who I've been able to stand back with the congregation and celebrate them and say, if the good idea was their idea, I want people to know it was their idea. If a program was a success because it was their effort, I want people to know it was their effort. Preachers get plenty of time in the limelight. We get to stand up uninterrupted most Sunday mornings. We get plenty of praise for the stuff. And so I've just always felt you want to gather good people and provide them whatever kind of encouragement and support they need to thrive. I think people want to thrive. I think people want to be successful. I've actually never been all that comfortable with the notion of head of staff.
Sure.
And I'm a collaborative kind of person. I know the reality is sometimes the head of staff thing has to happen. And maybe the most formative part of it, in addition to being a swimmer and a lifeguard, my favorite jobs that I ever had were for about 3 or 4 summers, I got to be a swim coach. So I was a swim coach for age group swimmers. So I had swim teams made up of children from the age of 5 to 18.
Oh, wow.
And so what that teaches you is you can't talk to a 5-year-old the way you talk to an 18-year-old.
No, certainly not.
And you can't talk to a beginning swimmer the way you can with somebody who is going to be a good college swimmer one day. That people are at different stages, and you've got to celebrate where they are at that stage and help them get to the next stage. And your success is based on them getting to the next stage. And so being a coach was some of the best training. And the truth is, if I could have talked to God out of this call to ministry, that was the job that I think I wanted for the rest of my life, is to be a swim coach. And I've got a good friend from college who has been a college coach. He knows how envious I am of him because I just loved that job. I loved seeing swimmers reach potential they didn't know they had. And that has had resonance not only as a head of staff kind of person, but I've tried to employ the same sort of things, watching church members kind of have a deepening faith commitment and watching them become more involved in the church than they ever imagined they would, or whatever. So, it stems from that time learning those things as a coach.
That's a really good skill that does apply in churches and in ministry, because when you encounter different people in the church, the way that you talk to one person is not necessarily going to be the best way to talk to somebody else. If I go to visit someone who's living in an assisted living facility who's maybe more traditional, I'm going to talk to someone like that in a certain way. Whereas if I'm talking to a 16-year-old who's at the youth group, I may talk to them in a different kind of way. And
as you should.
As you should. And so those lessons from coaching translate very naturally into a ministry context. How has the ministry changed over the years?
I don't think when I first entered the ministry, I don't think the notion of church shopping was a thing. I think there were I think people were Presbyterians or Methodists because their parents were, and they stayed with that franchise. And I think that has changed a little bit, and I don't think that's a positive change necessarily, because I think in an era when people shop for churches begin to think that they then have to market themselves. And I think that leads to cheapening who we are and who we might be.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a kind of an easy kind of observation. I think in my best notions, I've hoped that the church will be an institution within the culture that helps shape the culture. In the last decade or so, my fear is the culture is having more of an impact on the church than the church is having on the culture. And in a sense, it's an unfair fight, because the church, we have an impact. We gather folks together for a couple hours on Sunday morning, and they're saturated with the culture the rest of the week.
Yeah.
And this will make sense to you, but not to everybody. We learn liturgies in church that should help shape how we think about the world, but there are also liturgies at work out in the world.
That's true.
And they're far more exposed to the liturgies of the world but I do think, people still, the church still has such a vital role to play. And I'm still hopeful about the church. And a lot of people who are smarter than I am are writing a lot about this. There are a lot of headwinds facing the church these days.
Yeah.
But I think as Dr. Leith used to say, again, I'll quote him, he just used to remind us, but the church has something to say that nobody else will say, and that's what God is doing in the world. It still is a powerful message, and I still think that's our essential message, what God is doing in the world in and through Jesus Christ. And it's still the best hope for the world's healing, I'm convinced.
How have you changed? How has it changed you?
I used to say, when I had to write a personal information form years and years ago, I had this line that I'm not romantic about the church. That one of the benefits of being a preacher's kid was that I was not Pollyannish about the church.
Sure.
I knew the church was a human institution. though a good and wonderful institution. I mean, I guess I've changed. I hope I'm a better pastor because I have lived life and I have faced challenges and I've faced grief. I'm more attuned, I think, to the grief of others now because I've lost both my parents and our family. We faced challenges that have made me more sensitive to what it means to be human. So I hope I've become a better pastor. I hope I'm a better preacher than I was. I've got stacks and stacks of old sermons. I don't know what I'll do with them. I hope I'm a better preacher at age 65 than I was at 25.
I'm sure that it's got to be inevitable.
Yeah, but some things haven't changed. I mean, I still think the calling to ministry, it's such an honor. I've done this seminar with people, and it's a long seminar. But I've tried to wean people off of saying that if they're at a dinner party on Saturday night, I want them to stop saying, I got to get to bed because I have to preach tomorrow. What I want them to say is, I get to preach tomorrow.
Oh, yeah.
Because this is the long seminar I've done, is I walk them through this. And I learned this from a wonderful book I read a number of years ago, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which I love as a book. He sort of explains how when we were all hunter-gatherers, we all had to be hunter-gatherers. When we moved to an agrarian society, the same amount of land that would support X number of hunter-gatherers can now support a lot more people because we've got crops, and not everybody has to tend to crops. And so once we began to be agrarian, then people have time, then you can start having people who do things other than, and that's when a priestly class can emerge. And what I say to these young preachers that I talk to is I said, you don't add a thing to the gross domestic product. You don't contribute a thing to the economic well-being of the culture. But people who do give out of their resources because they think what you do is important for the community.
Yeah.
So you don't have to.
That's a stewardship sermon right there.
It's a stewardship sermon. So you don't have to preach. You get to preach. It's an honor that you get to do this because people who do add to the world's economy, who do add to the gross domestic product, give, in some cases, sizable amounts of their resources to maintain an institution that has hired you because they believe it matters to the world. In these days, I'm just sort of supply preaching here and there, but I still think it's important because the institution of the church still matters to me. Yeah. And I know there's a lot of kind of de-institutionalization going on.
Sure.
Years ago, I heard a speak. This is back in the 1980s. It's when the World Council of Churches was taking a lot of flack for just some pretty progressive stands. And this woman made this claim that said, if the World Council of Churches was disbanded today, tomorrow conversations would begin that would lead to the establishment of the next World Council of Churches because Christians collaborate.
Yeah.
Because they have work to do.
That's what it means to be the body of Christ.
And hearing that as a young pastor, it was just formative for me to say, yeah, we do. We've got to, and we don't always get it right. Sometimes we get out over our skis, and even with good intentions, we bungle things and we make people mad. But the work we have to do is so important. The institutions are still important. So.
Well, I want you to know how important I think the work that you have done is. I've, in the past couple of years, so I serve at a church in Oxford, Ohio. I'm in what's called the Presbytery of the Miami Valley. We'll do a whole other podcast one day about presbyteries. But a couple of years ago, I was at a presbytery meeting, and I saw a young woman walk in who looked an awful lot like Anna Owens, who was a friend of mine from First Pres in Sumter, until I realized that it, in fact, was Anna Owens. And so we had this moment of connection where we have made the journey from being in youth group together to now being pastors and colleagues and presbyters together.
I love that.
Chris Denny, of course, is still a dear friend and colleague. He's a child of that church who's gone into the ministry. And Trip Brogdon and I still keep in touch. And I was talking with Trip Brogdon the other day, and I mentioned to him that you and I were going to be chatting. And he said, and I echo this statement wholeheartedly, he said, I hope that Ed realizes how much of an impact he's had on all of us, because we're all here doing this.
Right.
to no small extent because of the impression that you made and the impact that you had and the example that you set. So I hope that you know that and how much we appreciate you being our pastor.
Well, that means a lot to me. And the crazy thing is, at some point, I started making a list of people who had either gone into full-time ministry or at least had dipped their toe in, And so I counted up people, even if they just went to a divinity school for a little while and decided it wasn't for them. But from the churches that I served from 1985 to 2023, I think I was up to like 18 or 19 people who had at some point given enough thought. And in my view, that's a great affirmation of the churches that helped raise those people, because there's some churches that a kid growing up would think, I don't want any part of this business. But Eastminster Presbyterian, First Pres Greer, First Pres Sumter, First Pres Raleigh have all encouraged people to venture out, at least give it an idea, whether they pursued it or not. But there are a bunch of y'all who are sticking with it, and yeah, it's a wonderful affirmation. So,
well, that's a wonderful legacy to have.
Yeah.
Ed, thank you so much for just taking the time to let me speak to you in this way. I've wanted to talk to you like this for many, many years, and it's such a pleasure, and it's great to see you. And thanks for letting me drag my microphones into your home and pester you like this. It's been such a joy.
I'm deeply honored, and I'm grateful to you for you and your ministry.
Well, all right. That's going to just about do it for this episode of Don't Encourage This. My very special thanks to my guest this episode, the Reverend Dr. Ed McLeod, for joining me in conversation. If you'd like to hear more conversations like this one, you can check out this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, the YouTube, all the different platforms where podcasts are found. But you knew that already because that's what you're doing right now. If you'd like to contact the show, you can find the email address for this program at don'tencouragethispodcast.com. From Oxford, Ohio, I'm Mark Von Bullock. Until next time, thanks again, folks.